Today, we make investments primarily tied to reducing the carbon intensity of molecules in the transportation, heavy industry, agriculture, and waste industries. In many cases, those investments are directed at the supply chain around low carbon fuels and gases, fuel alternatives, and carbon capture, use, and sequestration.
Your trusted source for information on the energy transition. This is the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Welcome to another edition of the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is our co-host, Jeff McCauley. Jeff, we're going to talk molecules today. How exciting is that?
Green molecules. Excited to get into some chemistry and a little bit of finance.
All right, well, let's dive into the show. Go ahead and bring our guests on.
Wonderful. So today we're joined by John Skrinar, partner at Cresta, a PE firm focused on energy transition infrastructure. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here.
So, John, you've got a long background in conventional energy, alternative energy, and project finance. Tell us a little bit about how you got to Cresta and your journey to get here.
Sure. Yeah, so I've been working around this energy broadly for almost 20 years. Started focused on conventional fuels, and most of the last 10 years really focusing on alternative fuels. I sat inside some of the largest trading houses that Glencore, Noble, Gunvor, that move molecules globally, and that's where I sort of honed my skills and got to know these markets and the players in the markets and the policies and regulations around everything that we're doing. I sort of left that trading world in 2019. Started working with private equity firms around the energy transition, larger firms that were getting pressure from their LPs and other constituents to start to think about energy transition investments, X wind and solar, looking for more higher returning opportunities. In that process, like sort of 2-year process, I got to know Chris Rosell and the partnership group at Cresta. They were, a young private equity firm, a group that had been together for 20 years. And they were part of a midstream company called Regency Energy Partners, and they created an entity called Wildcat Midstream, and then ultimately wanted to manage institutional capital and formed Cresta in 2016. Their first fund was a conventional energy, midstream and downstream focused infrastructure fund. And as a young private equity firm, most of our, roughly 90% of our LPs are endowments and foundations. In 2019, 2020, I think they started looking at the world a little bit differently. They started thinking, is conventional energy really where we want to be invested? And as Cresta, sort of went to their LP group to talk about their next fund, the feedback they got was, we actually can't, a lot of us can't invest in oil and gas anymore. And some of us are divesting from oil and gas. And then on the other side, a lot of our commercial counterparts, the Dow Chemicals and Exxon Mobils and Marathon Petroleums of the world, in 2020 or by 2020 had started to think about, alternative fuels, renewable diesel, renewable natural gas, carbon capture, the things that we're focused on. And so it was really, a perfect mix of both the commercial side, the people that we work with and for, telling us what they need, and also the investors coming to us and saying, "Hey, we've got to pivot a little bit."
This is wonderful. So it sounds like there's a real large pools of capital that, as you said, are trying to divest from upstream oil and gas. You're coming from a background with your partners of doing more traditional private equity, and now seeing that same customer, a lot of those same tools being able to be put to use in unconventional areas, so not the solar and wind that are basically low yielding. You started to get into a few things in that category: renewable diesel, renewable natural gas. What else is in that category? Ammonia, hydrogen, CO2, and then what what's the opportunity here to seek higher yields? A lot of these are still reliant on green premiums, so I want to get into that next. But first, help us figure out what's in the category.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think for us, it's any kind of molecule that where you can lower the carbon intensity. So again, it could be gasoline. That's a harder nut to crack, but it could be gasoline, it could be diesel, it could be jet fuel, it could be ammonia, it could be hydrogen, it could be methane, it could be any number of things, right? You could be displacing fuel use in a factory with thermal batteries, right? For us, that sort of falls in our categories. You could be using waste streams and using them as fuel to displace coal in cement kilns, right? So there's a lot of applications that we're evaluating, but I think for us it's finding ways, efficient, capital efficient ways, efficiency through thermodynamics, that you're using lower carbon intensity fuels or lower carbon intensity sources of power to run your businesses.
You've been in this sector a while, so I'm sure people with longer memories listening will immediately think of the first generation of biofuels, and you've seen that. So why is this time different for people who remember, RFS2 and ethanol and biodiesel? Now it's rebranded. Is there something new and exciting, or is what's going to prevent you from having a rehash of the first generation of biofuels?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most people, when you think about that first gen, most people go immediately to ethanol. And I think there were a lot of private equity firms and banks that lost their shirt in ethanol. It was easy to build an ethanol facility, relatively easy to build an ethanol facility. You could put a 100 million gallon facility up for relatively short capital. And there was a lot of incentives through the Energy Policy Act and others that drove a proliferation of corn and ultimately ethanol. And so, candidly, I don't know that there's that much difference between first gen, policy backdrop and second gen policy backdrop. We've seen state level policies certainly emerge, right? California, Washington, Oregon, New Mexico, British Columbia, now Canada as a country. There's pending legislation in New Jersey and New York and others. And so, I don't think that it's altogether that much difference. I think the capital requirements to build an ethanol facility versus a renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel facility are wildly different, right? I mean, you're talking about now the replacement cost for a sort of, call it world scale, 20 to 25,000 barrel a day renewable diesel facility is going to cost you somewhere between $2.5 and $3 billion. That's wildly different than an ethanol plant that's doing 7,000 or 8,000 barrels a day, sort of 100 million gallon type scale. So I think there's a perception that the renewable diesel market was sort of booming from 2019 to 2023, and there was certainly a lot of production capacity that was added as we launched our fund and made our investment at Brea in Newfoundland. There was probably 1 billion gallons of domestic U.S. production capacity, North American production capacity even. Now we're looking at 5 to 6 billion gallons of production capacity. So you could say that's expanded rapidly, and I think there's some questions on whether the EPA has the gumption to go and continue expanding the RFS. I think that also depends on the administration and certainly on Congress, and now it's the courts that are looking at like what power do they have. The Chevron decision may change things as you look into the future. But ultimately, I think the difference between 2024 and 2005, from my perspective, is a lot of the users of fuels, the Amazons, the FedExes, the UPSs, the Microsofts, any large corporation, have made they've made a lot of bold claims about lowering the carbon intensity of their operations. Obviously, it's easier for Microsoft to do that than it is for FedEx to do it, but they've all made a lot of claims that they're going to, in commitments to do that. And I don't really see them backing off those commitments. I don't think we've seen a lot of that. I think we've seen people recognize that, maybe, these sort of tools that we were using aren't the right tools, so we're going to pivot. And, I think Google recently announced that they're just going to focus on CDRs, and that's going to be the only tool they use to whether it's actual fuels or CDRs, carbon dioxide removal, sort of certificates, or however you want to classify that. And so I think those types of changes are happening, but I don't see those commitments being rolled back. And I think, our sort of position has been, if you feel like the cost of greenhouse gases is going to be lower in the future, we're probably not the right place for you to invest with. If you think that ultimately over the long term, the cost of greenhouse gases, whether it's on a societal basis or on a taxed basis or on just a fungible basis, is going to be higher, then the things that we're doing are probably the right place to be exposed to.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to the EPA and court. That's a whole can of worms.
It's a different podcast.
It's important, and I do want to come back to it. But first, maybe just clarifying biodiesel versus renewable diesel for the audience, because there are differences.
Sure.
And then go into, you mentioned the LCFS regulations, so just highlight what that means, why you think it's so impactful at the state level, and the fact that it's growing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, look, I think I sort of left it off as I started talking about ethanol, but ethanol and biodiesel as first generation biofuels were really blend stocks. I mean, there are certainly some E85 vehicles, and I know in Brazil there are some cars that run on 100% ethanol, but for the most part, as part of our fuel pool broadly, they are blend stocks. They're, you're putting in a 10% or maybe even a 20% blend of biodiesel into heating oil or diesel blends. You're putting 10%, maybe 15%, and obviously, again, in certain cases, 85% ethanol into gasoline blends. But, I think our ethanol blend, and don't quote me on this, but to me, I think it's now like 11 or 12% across North America. And so, there's that's the kind of impact that those have. When you think about renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel, they can be drop-in replacements, right? So in California, we've seen over the last 5 years, the renewable diesel share of the diesel pool increase wildly. I mean, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but I'm pretty sure it's close to 60% of the diesel pool in California is renewable diesel. That means that conventional diesel, and I think there's also still maybe 10% biodiesel getting blended. That means conventional diesel is probably around 30% of their diesel pool. 10 years ago, if you said that, I think people would have looked at you cross-eyed and said, there's no way that's going to happen. So it's happened. And I think, then the obvious sort of questions and criticisms are, well, the California policies have increased prices and have made forced these fuels into the market, but at a cost to the consumer. And I think we've seen a lot of studies come out that say the LCFS as a program has only added about 20 cents a gallon to the cost of fuels in California. And voters in California have supported this. I mean, they've supported it through who they've elected into their state Congress. They've supported it in the bills that they've stood behind. So, if you live in California and you want fuel, there's a little bit of a premium. There are other things that make California fuel expensive. There's a lot of taxes on their fuels, right? But if you think about the LCFS program as a whole, the numbers are pretty well tracked, and it's about 20 cents a gallon. It's probably even less now, given how low LCFS prices have been with the proliferation of all these fuels that we've seen between RNG and renewable diesel and things like that.
Now, do folks realize that they're using this fuel, or is it just, since it's drop-in, do you realize it's any different when you go to the pump?
Yeah, I mean, you have to label it, right? I think California is pretty clear about that. You can't just put it in there and pretend that it's something that it's not. But again, I think most people in California are okay using this fuel. It performs the same or better, and it it is making an impact, right? I mean, it is lowering the emissions. If you look at California's emission profile, it's lower than any state on a per gallon basis.
What is that doing for our demand for oil globally and from the U.S. market regionally? Are we seeing our demand going down yet, or is there still enough growth that it's offset by the renewables being built or used?
Yeah, I'm not seeing oil demand declining. I mean, I think there's every couple of years there's a call that we've hit peak oil, but I see demand continuing to rise. I mean, obviously you've got COVID and the fluctuations around that, but if you look on a much longer scale, it appears to me, like to Cresta broadly, that oil demand has continued to grow. Now, part of that is from developing countries that don't have the ability to blend in renewable diesel or ethanol even. But I think broadly we're seeing oil demand increase, right?
So let's talk about the green premium, because it sounds like the good news is these next generation of fuels are drop-in placements, but especially in things like sustainable aviation fuel, there's not a real path, as I understand it, to get to parity with existing fuels. Is that tolerable because it's a small amount of the blend, or do you see a pathway to that converging with market price?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a bunch of different ways to rank this stuff, but if you rank what's the highest and best use of biogenic oils, and that could be used cooking oil, soybean oil, tallows, canola oil, corn oil, right? It could be any of those types of products, but what's the highest and best use of those? From our perspective, when you're thinking about decarbonization, it's probably jet fuel, right? Ultimately, that's going to be the hardest to decarbonize. I think we're skeptical of the idea that you can truly power 18-wheelers with batteries and move large cargoes across the country. The physics just don't add up when you think about the energy density of batteries versus the energy density of diesel fuel. That could be solved, though, right? I think we could see technological advances over the next 20, 25 years that make that more and more likely to happen. Certainly, it's really difficult for me and my partners to think about aviation ever being electrified, just because of it's hard to fill up planes, tanks up with fuel, and fill the body up with people and baggage today as it is. All of a sudden, you change that balance, and let's say you fix that. You've also got a bigger problem with much heavier planes. You've got to replace every runway in the world, and you've got to make them longer and made out of more durable materials. Sorry about that, guys. And so, again, I think for us, sustainable aviation fuel, it is expensive, and there is a premium to it. I think there are emerging tools that are helping to offset those costs. I think you've seen groups like Microsoft and Boston Consulting Group who've recently announced deals with World Energy that are booking claim around their sustainable aviation fuel, where they're saying we're going to bear the cost. This is an effective way for us to reduce the carbon intensity and meet the goals that we've set out for our GHG profile. And so I think there's a lot of different things happening. The idea that you're going to take today call it a $2.50 Jet A fuel, and then you're going to sell into that market a $5 per gallon fuel, that's challenging, right? I don't think that the consumer is going to bear that cost. Certainly the airlines can't bear that cost. I mean, they run really tight margins to begin with. So if all of a sudden you double their fuel cost, which is their largest part of their OPEX, we're going to have a problem. So it's not certainly without its potential issues. But as you pointed out, Jeff, it is a really small portion of the pool today. So, if you said to the electricity markets in 1993 that 50% of your power is going to come from wind and solar at $175 a megawatt, they would have told you you're crazy, like we can't do that. Obviously, we've gotten to a point where, depending on where you are, That's not the case. It's cheaper. So I think when we think about the world, we think about technical, evolution and changes and better ways to do things. I don't think that's any different here. I think ultimately we're going to find ways to drive down those costs, whether it's through new feedstock sources that are planted in shoulder seasons between crops, whether it's technological advances that lower the need for hydrogen, or right. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you do at a refinery to make fuels, and so I suspect that if there is an increase in cost in greenhouse gases and carbon, that we'll probably find a way to reduce those costs to a point where they're palatable.
Yeah, and John, look, you're getting into some specific examples, so maybe and we've talked about some of the challenges. So are there some specific projects or plants that you're really excited about, that you either have already put money in or in late stages of contemplating it, that show where these investments really have impact for the end user and return for the investor?
Yeah, I mean, I can point easily to our refinery in Newfoundland, Brea. This is an old oil refinery that had a hard time, operating profitably leading up to COVID, and then certainly when COVID hit, it was the first refinery in the world to shut down. What made it a high cost oil refinery is sort of oddly makes it a low cost renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel facility, mainly because most of the RD and SAF facilities globally are, depending on feedstock deliveries from locomotives or trucks. Certainly some depend on the water, but having a massive infrastructure on an island that can take large cargoes of feedstock. When you think about where Newfoundland is on a map, it looks like it's far away, but moving things by water is just a lot more efficient than moving things on the road or by rail. And so that large scale infrastructure at an oil refinery that had always been fed by water was an advantage rather than a disadvantage. As an oil refinery, they didn't have a lot of local supply of crude, and they didn't have a lot of local demand, so they had to move things by water when a lot of their competition was moving things by pipeline. Exxon Baytown moves Permian crude in by pipe, and they move products out the Colonial Pipeline all the way up to New York. And that's a lot more efficient than moving things by rail or even by boat. But when you think about renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel, most facilities don't have those advantages, so they're advantaged in that way. And so I think when we look at that facility, we say, here's an interesting facility. It's got all the right, pots and pans. We've got to spend a bunch of money to retrofit them and change the metallurgy and reconfigure it, but the bones are there. And ultimately, this facility, when it's running at its optimal level with the right feedstocks, delivering into the right markets, should be operating pretty close to a refinery operating cost, right? There's no reason why we'd be too far off a conventional oil refinery's operating cost. The piece that does become, challenging is the cost of feedstocks. And I think for 20 years now, we've looked to predominantly soy and corn as feedstocks for biofuels. And that's changing. I think you're looking at things like camelina. And I know that camelina has been thrown around for 15 years, but it is starting to emerge. You're starting to see South American countries planting and being ready to harvest camelina. You're seeing large, swaths of land being planted in the West in Montana around camelina. And I think something like that, where it's a shoulder crop, you can plant it between the soybean crop or between the wheat crop or between the corn crop, and it doesn't have any land use change impacts. It doesn't need a lot of water, right? You start looking at these things that are emerging, that are potentials. All of a sudden, maybe that cost of feedstock comes down to something that's more in line with crude oil. Is it ever going to be cheaper? Maybe, I don't know, but I think just being more in line with it. Certainly, if you assign a value to carbon or to GHGs, that you can start to say, okay, this isn't the craziest thing ever. It's going to take some time to develop, but we can probably get there.
So what's happening, in your opinion, then in the hydrogen world? I see a lot of money. You're saying they're not going into some of these kind of futuristic things. A lot of companies and countries and investors pushing for hydrogen, green hydrogen. What's your opinion on hydrogen? You're a molecule specialist. Where do you think it's going?
I think there's been a lot of hype around hydrogen for too long. And you can go back decades. It sort of comes and goes. I just think that oftentimes the hype around what's possible with this zero carbon molecule, it sounds good, but the physics just don't follow that story. And the reality is, you've seen a company like Toyota basically start to abandon the hydrogen fuel cell that they've for 20 years championed. It's just expensive. It's small. It's not energy dense. It's leaky. It's a hard thing to move. And so when we look at hydrogen, we're looking at, is there a great resource that can generate green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, and localized, and a significant demand pull localized, right? If you can take 60% capacity factor wind, put it through an electrolyzer, make green hydrogen, and then use it on site, that's a compelling case, and that probably will pencil out over time. Certainly in the US, if we get some clarity on the 45V and you've got incentives that are there, that's going to make a ton of sense. But if you've got to take solar panels, make electricity, turn it into hydrogen, build a pipeline, and then move it, turn it into ammonia, and then move it through a pipeline, and then turn it back into hydrogen. It just, the yield losses, again, the laws of thermodynamics just say this isn't how this is going to work efficiently. So I think too many of those types of projects have been pursued, and too many of those types of projects have been championed. Not enough of the practical ones where you're taking hydrogen in a steel making process and you're producing it locally and you're using it right there, and you've now got either a green iron or a green steel. Or you're taking hydrogen and displacing gray hydrogen that's fed by, I think the highest carbon intensity of an oil refinery is taking methane and turning it into hydrogen and an SMR. That's like, it's twice as carbon intensive as the fuels that they're making or the crude oil that's going in. And so then you start to think about like, what could I do there? If I could make hydrogen next to a refinery or nearby a refinery, that might be impactful and that might be investable. But the idea of, trucks being fueled by hydrogen or cars or planes, it's just challenging. I think, again, it goes back to the simple physics. I'm not an engineer and I'm certainly not a physicist, but the simple laws that, if you just pay attention to them, tell you what may or may not work.
So, John, we got to get to a couple final questions and then we'll wrap. These are big topics, but hopefully you can help us narrow it down. So for folks who are listening who might be clean energy entrepreneurs, maybe portfolio companies in breakthrough energy or some of these other leading climate tech companies. So you said explicitly you want to be earlier stage than some of the giant funds, but not yet first of a kind. So what's the right stage for these companies to approach you? You kind of hinted at 50 million. Help us parameterize what fits in your sweet spot.
Yeah, I think for us, investments anywhere from 25 or 30 million dollars up to 150 million dollars sort of fit down the fairway, right? Those are the types of things we can make. We've made bigger investments, then we have to get creative and bring in other sources of capital and really build a capital stack around them. But 25 to 150 is easy for us to evaluate and get our heads around. I think where we play best is with experienced teams. It doesn't have to be, again, RNG was a new thing. We backed a team called LF Bioenergy in 2021 of, it was oil industry engineer DNA, and it was dairy DNA, and they came together to form a really interesting team. And they didn't have a project. They had a single MOU, but they had a great pedigree, and they had a great vision for what they wanted to build. That has been a wild success. We sold 49% of that business to Marathon in 2023. They're now effectively our JV partner in that business as it continues to build out. And that's a model that I think for us is very repeatable. Good teams with good pedigrees that understand what they're trying to do, that have a practical approach to it, but aren't necessarily at that final investment decision yet. They're still doing the development work. They've got some of their permits, but not all their permits. They've got some of their engineering sorted, but not all of their engineering sorted. We're great at helping them, cross that line. And then, most of our capital is deployed into construction projects, and that's really where I think, my partners and my experience over the last 20 plus years is building energy infrastructure and building, cryo plants and renewable diesel facilities and pipelines. I mean, that, whether you're moving crude oil or soybean oil, it doesn't really matter. It's a molecule that's getting moved through one of these processing facilities or through a pipeline network. And so I think those are the types of opportunities where we add a lot of value, and we can help a team, drag things across the line and into realization.
Okay, we have to come back to EPA. So you hinted at it, and maybe the way to constrain this is to have you make some predictions. So a lot of the things that you've mentioned may benefit from tax credits, 45Q perhaps, or other 45X things that are in there. But then also other targets and regulations potentially at the federal level. You already hinted that you think it's not going to be a monumental shift because, one, the end user adopters have their individual commitments, and LCFS, as you mentioned, are state level, so maybe not as impacted by federal. So it seems like you have a bit of an optimistic take here. Do you want to venture to make some predictions in the next 2 years that all of the tax credits that you're looking at are going to stay in place?
Well, I think that's a big part of our due diligence and our underwriting process is, we look at durable regulatory sort of framework. The 45Q, as much as that was an IRA sort of, an increase to the subsidy from $50 a ton to $85 a ton, that's a 14-year-old policy at this point. And it took them a long time to figure out the rules. I think it was, third year of Trump's presidency when they finally said, hey, here are the rules around the 45Q. And then, of course, Biden came in and gave a tremendous increase to that program, or, Biden and Congress to that program with the increase from 50 to 85. But that's not probably going anywhere. It's well supported on both sides of the aisle. Most of the states that benefit from it are red states, so it can be politicized. But I don't think that's going to be something that's going to get pulled out. The 45V and the 45Z, those are hot potatoes. And I think the Z is a perfect example. It's going to be subject to congressional review. It hasn't, the rules, this was passed 2 years ago, the rules still haven't been laid out for the industry. So it's really uncertain what that looks like. I'm not saying it's not going to be in place, but they were supposed to have it all sorted by the end of this year. They've effectively punted on that. And so it's hard to know how that gets, treated in the political, landscape of the next 6 months. I mean, there's a binary, election that's happening on November 4th. One way, you can probably read the tea leaves and think that things will stay status quo, and the other way, they're probably going to change significantly. But to sit here and say, well, the 45V is going to be dead if Trump is elected, I don't know about that. I mean, I think that what Exxon has said publicly is Congress passed a law and the rules were very clear and straightforward. Treasury has now taken that law and modified it to meet their constituencies or whoever's been sort of talking to them about what the 45V should look like. Exxon has publicly said, if you go by the letter of the law and you give us a tax credit for reducing the carbon intensity of the hydrogen that we make, we will invest in our projects. If you change the rules and make it more difficult, we're not going to invest in our projects. to me, he's a pragmatic guy, and he's a populist. He does what his supporters want him to do, and one of his biggest supporters is the oil and gas industry. And if Exxon is saying, "Hey, we're okay with this, but just don't make the rules too difficult to adhere to," maybe that doesn't go away like some of the other things that are there. So I don't know. Again, it's really hard to predict this stuff. We try to stay away from it when we make investment decisions. Those are things that we consider as upside cases. But to underwrite a 45V at this stage, that's suicide. I mean, I don't like. You might as well just flip coins for a living, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, John, we covered a ton of ground, from renewable diesel to sustainable aviation fuel to hydrogen, and now weighing into the alphabet soup of the tax code for renewable tax credits. We could talk for hours on this stuff. So really appreciate your depth of knowledge here, and it's inspiring to see putting real money to work in energy transition infrastructure. So thank you so much for the time today. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you guys. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can do it again soon. Maybe we'll do it after we see some of these programs come through, and we'll see if I was even close to being right.
I'm looking forward to that, to seeing how your predictions came out. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content as much as we did making it. If you did, please don't forget to comment, get engaged in the conversation, join us on our Discord channel, join us on the YouTube conversation, and we'll see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy. Bye for now.